July 1, 1916 dawned with deceptive serenity over the chalky fields of northern France. But Private Thomas Easton of the 11th Battalion, Suffolk Regiment, knew that within hours, this pastoral landscape would transform into mankind's closest approximation of hell on earth. At precisely 7:28 in the morning, the British artillery ceased its week-long bombardment, and an eerie silence descended upon the Western Front. For 7 days and 7 nights, over 1,500,000 shells had pounded German positions along a front stretching 18 miles from Beaumont-Hamel to Maricourt. The Allied High Command, led by Field Marshal Douglas Haig and French General Ferdinand Foch, had assured their men that nothing could survive such devastation. They were catastrophically wrong. Thomas crouched in the forward trench, his hands trembling despite the summer warmth. Around him, 20,000 men from Kitchener's new army waited for the whistles that would send them over the top. These were not career soldiers, but volunteers, clerks and miners and teachers who had answered their nation's call with patriotic fervor in 1914. They had trained together, forming what were called PALS battalions, entire units drawn from single towns or workplaces. The architects of this strategy had not considered what would happen if these battalions were annihilated. At precisely 7:30, Captain Wilfred Neville of the 8th East Surrey Regiment kicked 4 footballs toward the German lines, offering a prize to the 1st platoon to reach enemy trenches. The gesture, meant to steady nerves, instead highlighted the surreal innocence with which British command approached industrial warfare. Thomas watched officers scrambling up ladders, swagger sticks in hand, as if leading a parade rather than an assault. Then the whistles blew. Thomas climbed into no man's land and immediately understood their terrible mistake. The German barbed wire, which reconnaissance had reported destroyed, stood intact. Worse, the deep dugouts 30 feet underground had protected German machine gunners from the bombardment. As British soldiers advanced in neat lines carrying 66 pounds of equipment as ordered, German Maxim machine guns opened fire at a rate of 600 rounds per minute. According to records later compiled by military historian Martin Middlebrook in his exhaustive work, The First Day on the Somme, published in 1971 by Allen Lane Publishers, 19,240 British soldiers died on that first day alone, with another 37,000 wounded, making it the bloodiest day in British military history. This documentation would prove essential in understanding the magnitude of the catastrophe that unfolded. Thomas saw men falling in waves cut down before advancing 50 yards. The sound was apocalyptic, the mechanical chatter of machine guns, the screams of wounded men tangled in wire, the wet thump of bullets striking flesh. To his left, an entire platoon from the Bradford Pals disappeared in a single burst of fire. To his right, a shell landed among the Accrington Pals, vaporizing 12 men instantly. He threw himself into a shell crater, sharing space with 3 other survivors. One, a boy who looked no older than 17 despite claiming to be 19, sobbed uncontrollably. Another, a lance corporal named Davies, had been hit in the leg and was losing blood rapidly. The 4th man stared silently toward the German lines, his mind already broken by what he had witnessed. July 1, 1916 began for Gefreiter Klaus Schneider of the 180th Infantry Regiment, with the sudden cessation of British shelling, a silence more ominous than the thunderous bombardment that had entombed him and his comrades 30 feet below the earth for 7 endless days. Klaus climbed the wooden stairs from the dugout, stepping over debris, and past the bodies of 3 men who had been caught in the trenches during a direct hit on the 5th day. What he saw when he emerged made him question whether he had survived at all, or if this was some fever dream induced by days without proper sleep. The landscape had been transformed beyond recognition. Every tree, every building, every natural feature had been obliterated, replaced by a moonscape of overlapping craters filled with poisoned water. The chalk soil of Picardy had been churned into fine powder that coated everything. But Klaus had no time to contemplate the destruction. His sergeant was already shouting for machine gunners to take their positions. Klaus manned a Maxim 08 machine gun, positioned to provide enfilading fire across the British approach routes. The weapon, German engineering at its finest, could fire continuously when properly cooled with water. He had trained extensively on this gun during 1915, but nothing had prepared him for what came next. At 7:30 precisely he saw them, a wall of khaki stretching across the entire visible horizon, advancing in straight lines with parade ground precision. For a moment, Klaus could not comprehend what he was seeing. Where were the rushing tactics, the infiltration methods, the cover and concealment? These men were walking, actually walking, toward fortified positions defended by machine guns. His sergeant screamed the order to fire. Klaus squeezed the trigger, and the Maxim roared to life. Through the weapon sights, he watched men fall in clusters, 10 or 12 at a time. He traversed the gun left and right, unable to miss. The British kept coming, wave after wave, stepping over their own dead to maintain formation. It was not warfare, it was mechanized slaughter, and Klaus felt his sanity beginning to fracture under the weight of what he was being forced to do. To his left, another machine gun crew worked with equal efficiency. To his right, riflemen picked off officers identifiable by their revolvers and swagger sticks. The British had made themselves easy targets, adhering to parade drill in the face of modern weaponry. Klaus's gun barrel grew hot despite the water cooling, and he changed barrels twice in the first hour. A British platoon reached the wire directly in front of Klaus's position. They became entangled, hanging on the barbs like grotesque scarecrows, while his gun cut them down. One man, an officer, stood upright and fired his revolver at Klaus's position, a futile gesture of defiance before bullets tore through him. The officer fell backward, arms spread as if crucified on the wire. By noon, the attacks in Klaus's sector had ceased. Before his position lay hundreds of bodies, some moving weakly, most still. The cries of wounded men in no man's land created a chorus of agony that would haunt Klaus for the remainder of his life. Some called for their mothers. Others begged for water. A few simply screamed wordlessly until their voices gave out or death claimed them. Klaus had fired over 10,000 rounds. His hands shook uncontrollably. His sergeant offered him schnapps, which he drank gratefully, but it did nothing to erase the images burned into his mind. He had killed more men in 4 hours than he could count, and he knew with terrible certainty that this was only the beginning. July 2nd, 1916, found Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Fitzgerald, staff officer to the 4th Army headquarters, reviewing casualty reports in a requisitioned chateau 12 miles behind the front lines, and the numbers before him represented not merely a military setback but a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions that would require explanations he did not possess. Fitzgerald had served in the Boer War and believed he understood the nature of modern combat, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the magnitude of loss sustained in a single day. The reports arrived in waves throughout the previous evening and night. From Beaumont-Hamel in the north, the Newfoundland Regiment effectively ceased to exist, with 710 casualties out of 801 men who had gone over the top. From Thiepval, the Ulster Division had taken the Schwaben redoubt in a rare success, but supporting attacks failed, leaving them isolated and eventually forced to withdraw. From La Boisselle, the Tyneside Irish and Tyneside Scottish battalions had been decimated, entire companies wiped out in minutes. Field Marshal Douglas Haig had predicated his entire strategy on the assumption that the preliminary bombardment would destroy German defenses. Fitzgerald himself had reviewed the artillery plans and found them sound on paper. 1 artillery piece for every 17 yards of front, firing for 7 days. How could anything survive such punishment? The answer, now horrifically clear, was that deep dugouts provided perfect protection, and German positions were far more sophisticated than British intelligence had suggested. Fitzgerald walked to the operations map that dominated one wall of the chateau's library. Red pins marked British positions. Black pins showed confirmed German strongpoints. The line had barely moved. In some sectors, attacking units had advanced 100 yards. In most, they had gained nothing. The price for this negligible progress was 57,000 casualties, nearly 20,000 dead. The mathematics were unsustainable. At this rate, the British Army would cease to exist long before reaching Germany. General Henry Rawlinson, commanding the 4th Army, entered the room with his chief of staff. Rawlinson's face showed the strain of command during disaster. He had argued for more sophisticated tactics, for creeping barrages and night attacks, But Haig had overruled him, insisting on a straightforward assault that assumed German defenses would be crushed. Now Rawlinson faced the consequences of a plan he had doubted but loyally executed. "The attacks will continue," Rawlinson announced, his voice flat. "Field Marshal Haig believes we are on the verge of breakthrough. The German defenders must be as exhausted as our men. We need only apply pressure consistently." Fitzgerald felt his stomach turn. Apply pressure consistently. The euphemism meant sending more men into the same killing zones that had already consumed a generation. But he was a staff officer, not a commander, and his role was to implement decisions, not question them. The conference that followed established plans for renewed assaults. The 149th Brigade would attack Auvillers. The 34th Division would assault La Boisselle again. The pattern would repeat daily: bombardment, assault, casualty reports, planning for the next attack. Fitzgerald realized with dawning horror that the Battle of the Somme was not a single engagement, but the beginning of an extended campaign that would grind both armies to dust. He thought of the PALS battalions, recruited from individual towns with promises of serving together. The Accrington PALS had suffered 235 killed and 350 wounded out of 720 men. Accrington, a town of 45,000, would be devastated. Sheffield, Leeds, Bradford, and dozens of other communities would soon receive telegrams that would shatter entire streets, entire neighborhoods. July 5, 1916, brought Captain Elizabeth Lawson, nursing sister with the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, to the forward casualty clearing station at Highley, where the flood of wounded men had overwhelmed every available medical resource and transformed the facility into a scene that defied both description and sanity. Elizabeth had volunteered in 1914, driven by idealistic notions of service and healing. 2 years later, working 18-hour shifts in conditions that mocked the concept of sterile procedure, she understood that war medicine was not about healing, but about salvaging what could be salvaged and easing the passing of those beyond help. The wounded arrived in endless convoys of motor ambulances and horse-drawn carts. The classification system, developed to handle normal combat casualties, had collapsed under the volume. Theoretically, the station employed a triage system. Those who could return to duty received quick treatment and went back. Serious cases went to base hospitals. Dying men received morphine and spiritual comfort. But when thousands arrived daily, the system devolved into chaos. Elizabeth moved between rows of stretchers placed directly on the ground outside the overcrowded tents. A surgeon named Thompson, who had not slept in 36 hours, operated in one of 3 surgical tents, working with assembly line efficiency. Amputations took 7 minutes. Abdominal wounds, usually fatal, received cursory examination and morphine. Chest wounds got drainage and prayers. Thompson's hands shook from exhaustion, but he continued, because stopping meant men would die who might otherwise survive. A young soldier, both legs shattered by the same shell that killed 5 of his comrades, gripped Elizabeth's hand with desperate strength. "Am I going to die, sister?" he asked, and the formal address, "sister," that nurses insisted upon seemed absurdly inadequate given the intimacy of his terror. "You're going to England," Elizabeth lied gently. She had learned that small mercies mattered more than truth. The boy would likely lose both legs, would face years of pain and rehabilitation, would return to a society unprepared to deal with his disabilities. But he would live, which was more than could be said for most arrivals. In the corner of the tent, a chaplain named Reverend William spoke with a German prisoner who had also been wounded. The German, shot in the stomach, had perhaps hours to live. Reverend William spoke no German, the soldier no English, but they communicated through shared humanity, the chaplain holding the enemy soldier's hand as life drained from him. This small gesture of compassion in the midst of industrial killing reminded Elizabeth that humanity persisted even here. The smell was indescribable. Blood, feces, gangrene, disinfectant, and death mixed into an olfactory assault that caused new arrivals to vomit. Elizabeth had long since stopped noticing. She had developed the psychological armor necessary for this work, a distance that allowed her to see terrible wounds without flinching, to listen to screams without breaking down. A lieutenant arrived with facial wounds, his jaw partially shot away. He could not speak but wrote questions on paper with trembling hands. Elizabeth answered honestly. Yes, he would be disfigured. Yes, reconstructive surgery might help. No, he would never look as he had before. The lieutenant absorbed this information with admirable composure, then wrote one more question. Will my wife still love me? Elizabeth had no answer for that. By midnight, Elizabeth had assisted with 47 procedures, changed hundreds of dressings, administered morphine to dozens of dying men, and written letters for soldiers too wounded to hold a pen. July the 10th, 1916 arrived in the town of Accrington, Lancashire, with devastating finality when Mrs. Dorothy Hartley received the telegram she had dreaded since her son Robert had departed with the 11th Battalion, East Lancashire Regiment 9 months earlier, and the brief impersonal words transformed her comfortable parlor into a chamber of grief that would never entirely dissipate. The telegram, delivered by a solemn-faced boy who could not meet her eyes, read simply, "Deeply regret to inform you that Private Robert Hartley was killed in action on 1st July. The Army Council expresses sympathy." Dorothy did not scream or faint as women did in novels. She stood perfectly still, reading the telegram 3 times as if repetition might change its meaning. Then she walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on for tea, and sat at the table where Robert had eaten breakfast every morning of his life before enlisting. The kettle whistled, and she let it scream, because the sound matched something inside her that had no other expression. Her husband Arthur worked at the textile mill that had employed much of the Accrington Pals battalion. When he returned that evening, Dorothy simply handed him the telegram. Arthur read it, folded it carefully, placed it on the mantelpiece, and said nothing. They sat together in silence until darkness fell, neither eating nor lighting lamps, existing in a shared void where their son had been. The following days brought a cascade of similar telegrams throughout Accrington. The Pals Battalion, recruited from a single community with the promise that friends could serve together, had been annihilated at Serre on the war's first day. 3 streets near the Hartleys lost every young man. The local newspaper, which had published triumphant stories about the Pals' training and deployment, now printed column after column of casualty notices. Dorothy attended a memorial service at St. James's Church where Reverend Patterson struggled to offer theological comfort for an atrocity that defied religious explanation. How could a just God permit the slaughter of an entire generation? The Reverend spoke of sacrifice and duty and eternal life, but his words rang hollow in a sanctuary filled with widows and orphans and parents who would never recover from this wound. The government had encouraged Pals battalions as a recruitment tool, recognizing that men would volunteer more readily if they could serve with friends and neighbors. No one had considered the consequences of this strategy when entire battalions were destroyed. Accrington, with a population of 45,000, lost approximately 235 men killed on the first day alone, with hundreds more wounded. The town would never fully recover. Dorothy joined the Mothers' Union, a group of women who had lost sons. They met weekly, initially to share grief, eventually to channel their anguish into something productive. They rolled bandages, knitted socks, and wrote letters to soldiers who had no families. The work provided structure but no solace. Every bandage represented another wounded man, another mother's potential grief. Letters from Robert's surviving comrades arrived sporadically. They spoke of his bravery, his cheerful disposition, the respect of his fellows. One letter from a sergeant named Williams provided details Dorothy both craved and dreaded. Robert had gone over the top in the first wave, had advanced perhaps 50 yards before being struck by machine gun fire. Death had been instantaneous. The sergeant meant this as comfort, the suggestion that Robert had not suffered. But Dorothy found no comfort in any imagined version of her son's death. The war, which had begun with patriotic enthusiasm in 1914, now revealed its true nature. August 3, 1916 marked the 34th consecutive day of offensive operations along the Somme front, and Sergeant Major William Brennan of the 23rd Northumberland Fusiliers recognized with the clarity that comes from repeated exposure to horror that this battle had transformed from a planned breakthrough into a war of attrition that served no strategic purpose beyond the mutual destruction of armies. Brennan had survived the first day, through a combination of luck and a minor wound that evacuated him to a dressing station. After 10 days' recovery, he had returned to find his battalion rebuilt with replacements, most of them boys who looked terrified and had every reason to be. The nature of the battle had evolved since the catastrophic opening. Haig and Rawlinson had abandoned hopes of rapid breakthrough and instead adopted methodical bite-and-hold tactics. Limited attacks on narrow fronts, seizing a few hundred yards of trench, consolidating against counterattacks, then repeating the process. This approach reduced casualties per attack but extended the battle indefinitely, creating a grinding machine that consumed men and materiel at a steady, horrifying rate. Brennan's company had orders to attack German positions near Pozières, a village that had been fought over for weeks, and now consisted entirely of rubble and corpses. The preliminary bombardment began at dawn, shorter but more focused than the disastrous week-long bombardment that preceded the first day's attacks. At 600 hours, whistles blew, and Brennan led his platoon over the top. The advance followed a creeping barrage with British artillery shells landing 100 yards ahead and moving forward at a rate of 100 yards every 3 minutes. In theory, infantry would follow closely behind this moving wall of explosions, reaching German trenches before defenders could emerge from dugouts. In practice, the system required perfect timing and perfect execution, neither of which existed in the chaos of battle. Brennan's platoon advanced through smoke and dust, unable to see more than a few yards. A shell landed short, killing 3 men instantly and wounding 5 others. The survivors continued forward, maintaining the timetable because falling behind meant being caught in their own artillery. They reached the German front line and found it abandoned. The defenders had withdrawn to a secondary position. The secondary trench was occupied, and savage close-quarters fighting erupted. Brennan used his revolver to shoot a German soldier who emerged from a dugout. Another British soldier bayoneted a defender. A grenade exploded in a traverse, killing 2 men from both sides. The fighting was primitive and personal, nothing like the distant slaughter of the first day, but equally brutal in its intimacy. Brennan's platoon secured 50 yards of trench at the cost of 11 casualties. They immediately began preparing for the inevitable counterattack. Consolidation was the most dangerous phase. Exhausted men in unfamiliar positions, facing fresh German reserves attacking ground they knew intimately. The counterattack came at 800 hours, preceded by a bombardment that collapsed the trench in several places and buried 2 British soldiers alive. German infantry attacked in small, well-coordinated groups, using infiltration tactics that exploited every gap. Brennan's men fought them off with rifles, grenades, and desperation. The battle dissolved into a series of isolated struggles in different sections of trench. Brennan killed 3 German soldiers and was nearly killed twice, saved once by a private who shot a grenade thrower, and once by pure chance when a German rifle misfired. By noon, the attack was repulsed. Brennan's platoon had started with 38 men, 21 remained effective. For this price, they had captured 50 yards of devastated earth that had no intrinsic value beyond its location between other pieces of devastated earth. September the 15th, 1916, introduced a weapon that both sides had believed impossible when the first primitive tanks lumbered across the Somme battlefield near Flers, and Private James Hartwell of the 47th Division watched in astonishment as these mechanical monsters crushed barbed wire and crossed trenches that had stopped every previous infantry assault. The British called them tanks to maintain secrecy during development, pretending they were water carriers. The Germans called them Panzerwagen, or simply screamed in terror at machines that seemed immune to bullets and could bring death from within steel shells. Hartwell had been briefed about the tanks during an evening assembly 3 days earlier. The briefing officer, unable to adequately describe something no one had seen in combat, had resorted to vague descriptions. Armored vehicles, capable of crossing trenches, impervious to small arms fire. The reality was simultaneously more impressive and more pathetic than anything described. The tanks, officially designated Mark I, resembled enormous steel rhomboids mounted on tracks. They moved at walking pace, less than 4 miles per hour on good ground, slower across the cratered wasteland of the Somme. Each tank carried either 2 6-pounder guns or 4 machine guns, operated by a crew of 8 men working in unbearable conditions. Inside, Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Engine fumes and cordite smoke created a poisonous atmosphere. The noise was deafening, communication impossible. Hartwell watched tanks advance toward the German lines near Flers. Machine gun bullets sparked harmlessly off armor plate. The lead tank approached a German trench, tilted forward, and bridged the gap, its tracks gripping the far side and pulling the vehicle across. German soldiers fled or died at their positions, unable to stop this mechanical juggernaut. But the Mark I was a primitive weapon plagued by mechanical failures. Of the 49 tanks that attempted to advance, only 32 even reached the starting line due to breakdowns. Of those, 9 became stuck in shell craters or trenches. Several broke down from mechanical failure. Others were disabled by German artillery using direct fire, the only weapon effective against armor. One tank, commanded by a lieutenant named Hasty, penetrated the village of Flers and drove down the main street, firing machine guns at German positions. For the first time in the battle, British forces actually advanced beyond immediate objectives. Infantry following the tanks found German defenders demoralized and disorganized, unable to cope with weapons their training had not anticipated. But the success was limited and localized. Most attacks proceeded without tank support due to mechanical failures. The ground gained, while more substantial than previous attacks, still amounted to only a few miles of devastated landscape. The strategic situation remained unchanged. Two armies locked in mutual destruction with no end visible. Hartwell's battalion advanced behind 2 tanks toward Martinpuch. The psychological effect was profound. For months, they had gone into battle expecting withering machine gun fire. Now, the tanks suppressed German positions, creating lanes of advance. Hartwell reached the first German trench and found it abandoned, the defenders having fled before the mechanical monsters. But in the second trench, reality reasserted itself. Both supporting tanks had broken down, and German defenders, recovering from initial shock, fought with customary determination. The battle devolved into familiar patterns: grenades, bayonets, close-quarters brutality. By evening, Hartwell's battalion had advanced 1,000 yards, remarkable by Somme standards, but still far short of breakthrough. The cost was 147 casualties. October the 12th, 1916, brought the first sustained rain to the Somme battlefield, transforming the already devastated landscape into a quagmire that consumed men and equipment with impartial efficiency, and Lance Corporal David Murphy of the 9th Royal Irish Rifles found himself questioning whether drowning in mud represented a better or worse fate than being shot. The rain began during the night and continued without pause for 3 days, filling shell craters, collapsing trenches, and creating a landscape in which movement became almost impossible. The Somme soil, churned by millions of artillery shells, lost all cohesion when saturated. Men stepping off duckboard paths sank to their knees immediately, to their waists within minutes. Wounded soldiers, unable to extract themselves from mud, drowned in shallow craters. Artillery pieces sank until only their barrels remained visible. Tanks became hopelessly bogged, their tracks spinning uselessly in liquefied earth. Murphy stood waist-deep in a forward trench that was no longer a trench but rather a flooded ditch. Water seeped constantly from below, while rain poured from above. Pumps worked continuously but uselessly. The volume of water exceeded any capacity to drain it. Men stood in shifts, unable to sit or lie down, sleeping while standing upright like exhausted horses. Trench foot became epidemic. The condition, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet, caused feet to swell grotesquely, then turn gangrenous. Murphy had seen men whose feet had literally rotted off inside their boots. Medical officers inspected feet daily, ordering men with even mild symptoms evacuated. Refusing treatment led to court-martial. Trench foot was considered preventable, and therefore an offense if allowed to develop through negligence. Resupply became nearly impossible. Carrying parties required 6 hours to travel distances that normally took 1 hour. Ration details arrived with food spoiled by mud and water. Ammunition bearers dropped shells in the mud and could not retrieve them. Stretcher bearers needed 6 men to carry 1 wounded soldier, and even then frequently dropped their burden in the mire. An attack scheduled for October the 13th was postponed, then postponed again. Eventually it proceeded because cancellation would acknowledge that conditions made offensive operations impossible, and admission headquarters refused to make. Murphy's company was ordered to attack a German position identified on maps as Regina Trench, though no physical feature remained visible in the ocean of mud. The attack began at dawn. Murphy climbed from the trench and immediately sank to his knees. Forward progress required tremendous physical effort. Each step demanded extracting one leg from sucking mud, then planting it elsewhere, only to have it sink again. The line of advancing infantry moved at perhaps 50 yards per hour. German machine gunners, similarly miserable but safely behind prepared defenses, watched this slow-motion assault with something approaching pity before opening fire. Murphy fell, not from a bullet but from exhaustion. He lay in the mud, unable to rise, and watched other men struggling past him. Some were hit and collapsed into the mud, their struggles weakening, then ceasing. Others simply gave up, unable to continue, accepting court-martial as preferable to this continuation of torment. A sergeant dragged Murphy to a shell crater, where they sheltered with 5 other survivors. The attack had failed before reaching German positions. Of the 120 men in Murphy's company who had gone over the top, perhaps 40 reached even the halfway point. Casualties numbered 32 killed or missing and 43 wounded. The gains were nil. Murphy spent 18 hours in that crater before being relieved. November the 13th, 1916, saw Corporal Henry Preston of the 6th Manchester Regiment participating in what would become one of the final major attacks of the Somme campaign, a desperate assault on the village of Beaumont-Hamel that had resisted capture since the opening day 4.5 months earlier, and Preston carried with him the accumulated knowledge that this battle had become an end unto itself, no longer connected to any strategic objective, but continuing through institutional momentum and command pride. The November cold had frozen the mud into knife-sharp ridges that tore clothing and skin. Men who had endured summer heat and autumn rain now faced approaching winter without adequate shelter or warm clothing. Beaumont-Hamel occupied high ground overlooking the Ancre Valley. German defenses had been reinforced continuously since July the 1st, when the Newfoundland Regiment had been destroyed attempting to take these positions. Now, after 4 months of grinding attrition, British forces tried again with fresh troops, improved artillery coordination, and lessons learned at terrible cost. Preston's battalion had arrived at the Somme only 2 weeks earlier, transferred from quiet sectors where warfare consisted of occasional raids and artillery exchanges. The contrast was shocking. Everywhere Preston looked, he saw destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. No building stood intact, no vegetation survived. The earth itself seemed dead, poisoned by high explosives and contaminated by corpses that lay half buried in frozen mud. The attack began at 6:45 on November the 13th, following a bombardment that Preston's officers claimed was more sophisticated than the July disaster. Artillery targeted specific strongpoints rather than conducting random destruction. Creeping barrages were precisely timed, flanking attacks coordinated to prevent German reserves from concentrating. Preston went over the top with his platoon, advancing through morning mist that reduced visibility to 20 yards. The creeping barrage crashed ahead, and Preston followed at the prescribed distance, close enough to feel concussion waves, far enough to avoid being killed by British shells. They reached the first German trench and found it abandoned, the defenders having withdrawn to avoid the barrage. The second line was occupied. Preston's platoon attacked with grenades and bayonets. Fighting was savage but brief. The German defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, retreated to a third line. Preston's company secured objectives within 2 hours, a remarkable success compared to earlier attacks. But success was relative and temporary. German counterattacks began at noon, supported by artillery that had not been identified or destroyed. Preston's company held throughout the afternoon, but casualties mounted steadily. By evening, the company had suffered 86 casualties out of 142 men. November the 14th brought more attacks, more casualties, more incremental advances. The village of Beaumont-Hamel fell on November the 18th, and with its capture, the Battle of the Somme officially ended. Preston survived, one of fewer than 50 men from his original company still standing. That night, in a dugout that had been German before becoming British, Preston attempted to comprehend what he had experienced. The battle had lasted 4.5 months. Territory gained measured roughly 6 miles at its deepest penetration. Casualties exceeded 1 million men from all sides. British losses approximated 420,000, French 200,000, German somewhere between 400 and 600,000, though exact figures would never be known. Preston wrote a letter to his parents, trying to explain something that could not be explained to anyone who had not lived it. He wrote about the mud and cold, the constant artillery, the friends lost. He wrote nothing about the actual killing, the terror, the moral injury of participating in mechanized slaughter. Some things could not be written and certainly could not be understood by those who remained home. December the 20th, 1916, found former Private Arthur Dalton of the 14th Royal Warwickshire Regiment, sitting in a military hospital in Brighton, staring at the English Channel and trying to reconcile his memories of the Somme with the peaceful sea before him. While in France, both armies settled into winter quarters and began the process of absorbing losses that would reshape European society for generations. Dalton had been evacuated in October with severe shell shock, a condition military physicians were only beginning to understand, and which army authorities frequently dismissed as cowardice or malingering. Dalton could not sleep without experiencing nightmares so vivid that he woke screaming. He could not tolerate sudden noises. A dropped plate in the hospital cafeteria sent him diving under the table. He trembled continuously, his hands shaking so severely he could barely write. Most distressing, he had lost the ability to articulate his experiences. When he tried to speak about the Somme, words failed him, replaced by inarticulate sounds of distress. The hospital housed hundreds of similar cases. Men who had survived the battle physically but were psychologically destroyed. Some would eventually recover. Others would remain institutionalized for life, unable to reintegrate into a society that had no framework for understanding their trauma. The term shell shock itself was inadequate, suggesting a temporary condition caused by blast concussion, when the reality was much deeper. Moral injury, existential rupture, the shattering of fundamental assumptions about human nature and civilization. In France, the battlefield was gradually being abandoned. Both armies withdrew to winter positions, leaving the Somme as a vast graveyard. The dead remained where they had fallen, too numerous to retrieve. Some bodies lay on the surface, others were buried in collapsed trenches or shell craters. Thousands were simply missing, blown to pieces too small to identify or buried so completely that they would never be found. The strategic results of the battle were minimal. The German army remained unbroken and would fight for another 2 years. The British and French armies had not achieved breakthrough. Some argued that the battle succeeded in attrition, bleeding the German army of reserves it could not replace. Others called it criminal incompetence, sending men to die in futile attacks that achieved nothing beyond killing. Dalton thought about his friend Robert, killed on the first day, buried in a shell crater that itself was then destroyed by subsequent shelling. Robert's body was never recovered. His name would eventually be carved on the Thiepval Memorial to the missing of the Somme, along with 72,000 other names of British and South African men who had no known grave. The town of Accrington, which had sent the PALS battalion, erected a memorial. Similar memorials appeared across Britain, France, and Germany, small towns commemorating local men who had marched away together and died together. The policy of forming PALS battalions was quietly abandoned. No one wanted to repeat the experience of losing an entire generation from a single community. Years later, historians would debate the Battle of the Somme endlessly. Some would argue it was necessary attrition that ultimately led to Allied victory in 1918. Others would call it futile butchery, the worst example of military incompetence in history. Veterans like Dalton rarely participated in these debates. They found that people who had not experienced the battle could not understand it, while those who had experienced it could not articulate it. Dalton would eventually leave the hospital, though he would never truly recover. He would work as a clerk, marry, have children, and live until 1963. Dying 2 years before the 50th anniversary of the battle. He rarely spoke about the Somme, and when he did, it was in fragments, disconnected images that his family could not assemble into coherent narrative. The Battle of the Somme ended, but its echoes continued through generations. The men who survived carried it within them. The families who lost sons, fathers, and brothers were marked by absence. The societies that sent millions to die in industrial warfare were fundamentally changed. Their faith in progress and civilization shattered by the reality of mechanized killing. In the end, the Somme represented both a military engagement and a civilizational rupture. One battle, 1 million dead, and the world that emerged was irrevocably different from the one that had existed before July 1, 1916.